Welcome to this webinar, Safe and Effective Digital Therapy Assistance, brought to you by SBK Healthcare and sponsored by Limbic. To find out about further educational podcasts, webinars and online forums, please do go to our website, iapt-nnf.co.uk. Thank you.
As Vanessa said, I'm Ben. I'm the Director of Special Projects at Limbic, and by means of quick introduction, I've been working over the past 3 years or so, working closely on areas of compliance and regulation, clinical safety, product quality, data and cybersecurity. So before we introduce our guest speaker and jump into the talks, we're going to run a quick poll. So as you can see here, the question is, what is your biggest safety concern when using digital tools? If you head to or get your phone up and open the camera and scan that QR code, or using the URL slido.com there and the ID number in the bottom, you'll be able to submit your responses to this question. So we'll give everyone a minute to do that. Data protection, excellent, you've come to the right place. So that's one of the core pillars that we're going to cover in this webinar. So we tend to think of risk management as a whole around data protection, clinical risk, which you can see there, and also product quality. So we've got risk is coming up largely. What else have we got here? Identity theft, interesting. So we can talk to potentially in the discussion later around authentication and how you deal with those kind of practices. Not identifying risk, I assume is in the context of risk patients when we're talking here. So again, this is something we can speak to a bit later on. Breaches of confidentiality, yes. Responding to risk in a timely way. Okay, cool. So there's some core themes there around risk around the actual product itself, but also around, I guess, patients, they're identifying with risk as well. So we can get on to discussing some of these later in the Q&A session that we've got coming at the end. So without further ado, I will now introduce our esteemed main speaker, who we're delighted to have joining us today. We've got Dr. Tom Micklewright, who is the Medical Director of ORCHA and has spent over a decade in various senior positions across the British Medical Association and across the NHS. And also alongside his role at ORCHA, he's also a medical advisor at Omron Healthcare and a GP based in Chester. So a lot on his plate, and he's probably Superman on side as well, who knows. So without further ado, that's enough from me. And Tom, I'll hand over to you.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Ben, for the really lovely intro. All right. Here we go. Can we go to the next slide, please? So my name's Dr. Tom Micklewright. Like Ben said, I work for ORCHA, the Organisation for the Review of Care and Health Apps. And just a little bit about what ORCHA does. ORCHA is about making digital health healthy. It's a wild west out there when it comes to digital health. And we find that not only does that put patients at risks, but also it puts clinicians off from talking about digital health, because it's exceptionally difficult for us to know the safest, most effective digital tools to be recommending to our patients. And that's kind of why I came to ORCHA. I'm a big believer that we need to start empowering our patients to take greater ownership of their health. I think healthcare has become incredibly paternalistic. I think patients feel disempowered. They feel scared and frightened by their health. And if we can give them the tools that they need to take more charge of their health, to play a more active role, then I think that's better for their health. It may be better for their wellness. And I think also it's the best way to try and relieve some of the pressures on the health service. So when I found out about the work that ORCHA was doing in trying to increase the uptake of the best digital health across the health service, I was ready to jump on board. Next slide, please. So this shows a little bit about the health market and how it's expanded over the last few years. You can see that there are over 300,000 health apps out there in the world. So a huge number, and no wonder amongst all of those, it's exceptionally difficult to find the right ones. I mean, just have a think now about how many health apps you're aware of, or even how many you've recommended, whether it's the patient's friends or family. For most clinicians I speak to, it's about 3 to 5 out of 300,000. So there's a huge number out there that we need to kind of filter through. And you can see that this isn't a cumulative graph. This shows how many new entrants there are to the market. You can see that there was a peak around about 2018. And although year on year, we're seeing fewer products enter the market, that's likely just because developers have cottoned on that actually we can't just flood the market with rubbish stuff. The standards and expectations for digital health has gone up, which is most likely why the number of new entrants on the market has come down. But we are still seeing, almost 20,000 new apps being released a year, 13,000 being released a month. So huge numbers. Next slide, please. This shows a little bit about mental health. So curiously, even though when you look across health apps generally, year on year, the number of new entrants is going down. For mental health, it seems the opposite. This graph is a cumulative graph, and you can see that the steepness of that curve is increasing exponentially. So we are rapidly getting more and more mental health apps entering the market. And that's partly driven by demand. The table on the left shows the increase in search terms used on the app stores, the Google App Store, the Apple Store. It shows for those search terms the increase in searches done during the pandemic. So you can see figures well over 200% for a range of different mental health search terms. So it's likely that your patients are already searching for these things online. That's why we're seeing such an uptick in new mental health products entering the market. But that's also why we need to take the issue of risk, safety, effectiveness really seriously. It's not simply enough for clinicians to say, well, I won't recommend these products anymore, because our patients are still searching for them and potentially accessing inappropriate or at worst, dangerous tools. Next slide, please. So are digital health tools safe and effective? Well, we believe there are. There is a mountain of evidence that's continuing to build in support of the effectiveness of health apps. There's research in mental health that shows that digital therapy can be just as effective as face-to-face therapy and helps with patients that might struggle to attend face-to-face therapy sessions. And this is supported recently by NICE. In 2019, they updated their guidance for managing depression in young people to make reference to digital health tools. And they're also doing a scoping exercise now to see whether they can start building an evidence base to specifically recommend 4 or 5 digital tools in the areas of depression and anxiety. So NICE are getting to the point where they're going to start saying, we endorse this particular tool, this particular tool. That's kind of where we're getting to. And then that figure on the right is from ORCHA. We know that doing our own quality assessments of digital health tools, that only 20% meet quality standards. So if you've got a patient who's in an app store and they're just going off of star ratings, they have a 4 in 5 chance of downloading something which fails basic quality standards. And that is a scary figure to be working with. Next slide, please. I feel like Chris Whitty today. So we know that at ORCHA, from research that we've done with healthcare professionals, there are a number of barriers to getting clinicians comfortable using digital health. Interestingly, on the word cloud, risk came up as the biggest thing, and we found that risk generally across clinicians is the biggest barrier, this sense of, this is too risky for me to engage in. There's also a confidence issue. Even when you tell clinicians, don't worry, we've kind of taken the risk away, there's still a sense of, well, I don't know what the good apps are or how they kind of operate. And unless I feel confident in this space, I'm not going to be talking about digital health. There's a question about process. Even if I do know about some useful digital health tools that can help patients with mental health, how do they fit in the process? Where in the consultation do I suggest it? Who recommends it to a patient? How do I follow patients up? So there's a bit of uncertainty there. And then I think despite the best efforts of key players like NICE, NHSX, NHS Digital, and even ORCHA, there is still a lack of system leadership. Organizations are still a little bit reluctant to put their neck on the line and say, we endorse digital health technologies. And until that leadership is in place, I think a lot of frontline clinicians feel uncomfortable with being the pioneers in that area. Next slide. For patients, though, it's much simpler. The barrier is just about trust. And emerging research seems to suggest that if patients are recommended a health app, rather than going out there and looking for it on their own steam, they're more likely to download it, use it, and stick with it, because our recommendations, our expertise carries a lot of weight. It's trusted. And that's why we are key enablers when it comes to engaging our patients in digital health that can help. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about safety and how we assess safety at ORCHA and some of the different safety standards. Then we're going to talk a little bit about evidence and how we weigh up evidence. And then I'm going to lastly talk about how I use digital health in my practice and some suggestions for how you could start using it in yours and things to be aware of. Next slide. So I always think when we're thinking about safety, think about you purchasing a new car, all right? I take a few moments to think about the kind of things you'd be asking for if you want to make sure the car is safe. So the first thing you might ask is, was it designed with safety in mind? You know, I mean, some car brands, they'll build their entire brand on safety being a core part of the company's ethos. So was it designed with safety in mind? Next slide. Well, the specific safety features, you know, does it have beepers if you get too close to the car in front? Does it have airbags? Does it have kind of skid prevention? Do you want to know about specific features? Next slide. You want to know if you have an issue after you've bought it, how do you flag that up? And what are they going to do about it? You know, will they give you a new car? Will they roll out the lesson across their factories to make sure it doesn't happen again? Will they replace the part? So how do they deal with defects? Next slide. Do they have a safety person? Do they have a safety engineer on their team who specifically inspects the car for safety before it's released? Next slide. How is it tested? If they say they test, you know, 1 in every 5 cars to make sure it's safe, is that enough reassurance? Or if it's only 1 in 20, 1 in 100, or if they don't do any safety testing at all, do you want to know that there's some kind of quality control process and testing in place? And next slide. And the final thing you want to know is if you're buying a car from Toyota and they use airbags from somewhere else or a GPS system from somewhere else, how do they make sure that those bits that they haven't built themselves are also safe? Next slide. And thinking about it in that way explains some of the things that we look out for when we're assessing digital health technologies. So is there a risk management plan that says as new features are being developed, it says the checkpoints of which you consider safety throughout the journey? What are the safety features? So where risks have been identified with a product, what control measures are put in place to lower the risk? What have they done specifically to minimize the safety issues when they have been identified? Is there an incident process, a way of reporting things during production and also once something's live and being used by patients? In the digital health world, a safety engineer is the clinical safety officer, and most organizations will have the safety officer kind of mentioned on their websites or their marketing materials. So do they have a clinical safety officer? Do they do regular testing and safety audits? And then lastly, do they do a third-party assessment? So if they're using most digital health tools, they'll have integrations, they'll kind of link into other things, other products. So for instance, I previously worked at a telehealth organization that did remote consultations. But a telehealth company, actually, they use video consulting software from somewhere else, audio from somewhere else, a prescription mailing service from another company. So we had to safety assess all of those constituent products as well as our own telehealth service. So these are, again, feel free to jot these down, but you'll have the slides afterwards. These are kind of the key processes that we look for to make sure that safety is at the heart of a digital health technology. Next slide. So fundamentally, it's about process. It's about making sure, are these things there? Are they thorough enough? Are they being followed? and are they being tested? And in the UK, we've got something called the DTAC, which you might have heard of. DTAC stands for Digital Technology Assessment Criteria, and it's a checklist that was produced by NHS Digital. The idea being that if you're an NHS organisation and you're looking to procure a digital health solution, you go through this checklist. The checklist looks at not just digital safety, but also things like information governance, data, technical security, usability and accessibility. You go through this checklist, and in the safety bit, you're literally checking, is there a risk management process? Is there a clinical safety officer? Is there this? Is there? So you're checking to make sure each of the documents is in place. Next slide. Now, this slide just illustrates a few different approaches to assessing safety. So I've already mentioned about the DTAC, which, like I said, is a checklist making sure that there's evidence that each of those key processes are being followed. And it's great for an organization that's thinking of buying a solution. The problem is it takes time. You need a relationship with the developer because they've got to send you all of their documentation. So that's why it works better in a kind of I'm purchasing your solution kind of relationship. And also because it takes a while, it's not something that can be rapidly updated. So if a health app or a digital health tool updates in a couple of months' time, potentially that DTAC is out of date. What ORCHA does, the ORCHA assessment is we take a different approach in that we try and do these assessments without necessarily needing to engage the developers. We try to evaluate the whole health app market, all 300,000 of those apps. And a lot of the developers we reach out to won't necessarily engage and won't want to share their documentation. So as a result, the ORCHA baseline assessment goes off publicly available information that shows they're following those key processes. So is there a publicly available risk management process? Can we see if there is a clinical safety officer? Do they have a CE mark? So that's the way the ORCHA assessment works. And although it means that we don't always have access to the same level of documentation that the DTAC does, the advantage is we can do these quickly. We can update them rapidly if a digital health app goes through an update. And it also means we can just get through that list of 300,000 without the bottleneck of needing developers to engage with us and share the documentation. And the final bit I want to add there is a clinical assessment. Now, at the moment, the ORCHA is ORCHA's the only organisation I'm aware of in the world that has clinicians doing some of their assessments, especially for higher risk apps. And we think this is important because for higher risk apps that are involved in treatment or diagnostics, you often do need a clinician to help contextualize some of the risks. So our clinician will look at things like, is the personalization of the app appropriate? Are there any AI-enabled features? And what's the extent of the harm that those AI features could cause to a patient? And what risk control measures can we see in the app when we're using it? Next slide, please. So I think the key points here around safety is that you assess safety by looking at safety process. For you, where you are, I would start, if there's any apps that you're thinking of purchasing as an organisation, seeing if it's had a DTAC anywhere, whether ORCHA have done a DTAC assessment or your organisation has done a DTAC assessment. If not, though, that doesn't write off the organisation, but consider other ways you could validate the fact that they have safety processes in place, like looking at their websites and looking at their publicly available information. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about evidence and how we scrutinize that to make sure that's up to scratch. Next slide. Imagine that I'm introducing a new medication, a new antidepressant that I want us to start recommending. What kind of evidence would we expect to see? A randomized controlled trial, meta-analysis, maybe a pilot that's happened across multiple sites to make sure it's safe. Next slide. When I ask people what evidence they expect from digital health, usually the first thing they'll say is, well, the same we'd want from a new medication. We want the RCT, we want the meta-analysis. We recently assessed an app that took a calculator from the NICE website for administering IV fluids and just transposed it onto a website that we evaluated. And we said, look, your app is, it's potentially guiding and influencing treatment, and really important treatment that could carry significant harm if it's done wrong. We expect to see an RCT, really, is the minimum evidence. And the developers didn't have it. But curiously, they said, look, we don't understand the NICE form that NICE have generated and you can print off and it's on our wards. That's never had an RCT. That's never had a multi-site trial. That was just developed by an expert panel of clinicians, and it's used across the country. Why are the standards different? Because one's been printed and one's been put on a website. And it was a good challenge, in fairness. Which brings us to the first issue when you're assessing evidence in digital health. Next slide. Proportionality. Not all digital health is the same. Not all digital health carries the same risks or achieves the same outputs. So as a result, the evidence you expect has to change in proportion to what the digital health tool does. Next slide. The other thing is, I showed you this chart before showing the number of digital health products entering the market. This is scary, but this is also a sign of innovation. We've got a very competitive market with some amazing products coming through and getting through, and we want to encourage that. But when you look at the pharma industry, it takes 12 years for a single product to reach a market at a cost of over £1 billion. If we completely replicate the pharma industry, we will strangle innovation in digital health and get to a situation where the only ones producing apps are big pharma companies that release one app every 12 years. That's not what we want to achieve at all, but we don't want to compromise on safety. Next slide. So this second issue is one of pragmatism, considering the newness of a technology, considering the need that it might be able to close. What evidence are we willing to accept, and where we might be prepared to loosen our expectations or apply a few caveats? Next slide. So NICE's approach to this was to develop an evidence standard framework where they tier digital health products based on what they do. And at different tiers, they expect different levels of evidence. Next slide. So you can kind of see here the tier B is relatively low level. It might just be symptom diaries or maybe two-way communication channels, a bit like WhatsApp between a patient and a clinician. Whereas tier C, the highest tier, those are the apps that tend to get involved in diagnostics or treatment. And even within tier C, depending on what the app does, whether it actually delivers treatment or whether it just guides treatment, will impact what level of evidence is needed, whether you do need multi-site RCTs, whether a high-quality cohort or otherwise observational study is acceptable. So that's NICE's approach with those three tiers. Next slide. At ORCHA, we started off following NICE's approach, but we kind of realized there were too many apps that were falling between the cracks. For instance, there were some apps that focused on behavioral and preventative change, things like smoking cessation apps. And although the app was, it was really wellness and well-being focused, because it was being considered to guide treatment or to treat a specific condition, it was being put in a really, really high tier. And we felt it shouldn't be held to the same standards as something that was, diagnosing a heart condition. Likewise, we found that there were some apps that were purely wellness focused, but actually were doing a lot of personalization and manipulation of data. Things like, personalized diet or exercise plans. So even though they fell into the wellness space, they were doing things that were quite bespoke and customized and probably needed an extra layer of rigor applied to their assessment. So we created some additional tiers, and you can see there we state the minimum evidence we require for each of those tiers. Next slide. So we talked a little bit about proportionality, a little bit about pragmatism. The last thing I want to say is that evidence isn't just a tick box. Next slide. It's also about quality of that evidence. It's worth saying that DTAC doesn't ask about evidence at all. And the NICE evidence standard framework doesn't really talk about the quality of that evidence. But when we're doing our assessments, we want to know what the statistical significance of the results. Was there a valid comparator? Has the product been tested in the real world or just in a very artificial setting? And even if there is a statistical improvement, is it clinically meaningful? Reducing a PHQ-9 score by 1 point probably isn't hugely significant in, compared to other measures of improvement. So it's as much about the quality of the evidence as much as it's about, is it there or is it not? Next slide. And I want to again illustrate with an example. We reviewed a mental health app which claimed to be able to screen patients for 51 mental health conditions. And when we first took a look at this app, they said, we've got loads of evidence. We've got evidence showing our questionnaires and surveys are validated. Take a look. And when we dug into the evidence, we found actually their research only showed that 4 of their questionnaires were concordant, so were equal to 4 mental health questionnaires around depression and anxiety, like GAD-7. So only 4 out of their 51 questionnaires had a concordant study. And we also found a lot of the questionnaires they'd built and said were validated, they'd actually just built them using DSM-5 criteria, which isn't really what DSM-5 is for. It's not a questionnaire book, it's a diagnostic aid. So the idea of just taking those points, putting them into question forms and giving them to patients, that was not a validated questionnaire. And the app also used evidence-based suicide scales, which NICE have since come out and said should not be used under any circumstances. So this was a good example of where, yes, there was evidence, but was the evidence appropriate? Was it of decent quality? And the answer was no, and we weren't happy to host this app on any of our formularies or libraries. Next slide. So when it comes to evidence, like I said, we want to be looking at the quality, the proportionality, and also for being pragmatic in our expectations. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the practicalities of using digital health in your practice. Next slide. So a question for all of you, just spend a little moment thinking, how do you usually recommend health apps to your patients? When I usually ask people this, my colleagues, other clinicians, they usually say either, I generally just show them the app on my phone and say, check out Headspace, it's really good. Or they'll say, I've got a friend or a colleague or a great aunt that use this tool and maybe you want to give it a go. I know because I used to do that. I used to recommend Calm, the Calm app for meditation a lot to patients. I'd never used it myself, but I'd heard that other people found it useful. And I knew a little bit about the evidence behind mindfulness. So I kind of felt it was a safe option to recommend. But just consider this for a moment. I tell a patient, download Calm, it's on my phone, it's great. Next slide. Potentially, I don't write it down, so the patient spells it wrong, and they end up accessing incorrect apps on the App Store. Here's one, a management system, when you spell Calm wrong. And next slide. They could even access this, which looks like much more fun, but probably isn't going to help them with their mental health condition. Next slide. The other thing is they might just remember you said something about meditations. They type meditation into the App Store and there are hundreds of meditation apps and they have no idea how to find the one you recommended. Next slide. What's worse, they might say, they might put in a complaint later and say, the doctor said that for my stress, I should use Smash the Office Stress Fix and it hasn't helped at all and now I'm going to complain. And you've got no record anywhere of what you recommended because you just flashed it up on your phone. And then you end up having a disciplinary procedure because everyone thinks you recommended Smash the Office. Next slide. The other thing is you might recommend Calm to a patient and they go onto the App Store and they say it looks too commercial. They're not really happy with how it looks. They're worried it's going to steal their data, so they don't trust it. So here are a few examples of how just waving it on your phone or saying, Auntie Judith tries this, isn't an appropriate way to engage patients safely in using digital health. Next slide. The truth is, when we're working in practice with digital health, we're stuck in this under-the-counter culture. We wouldn't prescribe medications in this way. We wouldn't start an antidepressant by flashing it on our phone, waving a prescription packet or scribbling on a piece of paper and giving it to a patient. We just wouldn't. But some of the digital therapeutics now carry the same level of risk. So we need to get above the counter when we're using these. Next slide. The truth is, with digital health, the legal ramifications are untested. We haven't had a situation yet where a clinician has recommended something digital and the patient's brought a lawsuit against them. So we don't know fully what the legal ramifications are, but they can potentially cause harm. We know these tools do change constantly, 1 to 2 updates a month on average for apps. So recommending an app that's safe today, it might change by the time you're recommending it tomorrow. And like I said, there is this difference in apps. There are some apps that are much more risky than other apps, and we might have a difference in approach where we want more due diligence for those riskier apps, and perhaps there are other apps we're happy for patients to access in their own steam. Next slide. So here are just a few pointers really to help you get comfortable with using digital health. We've talked a lot about risk and a lot of the ways you can assess safety and evidence, remembering that you're looking for safe process. And when it comes to evidence, you want to make sure you're being proportional and pragmatic, but that you're also looking for quality. And you can either use, you can either do this on your own steam, or you can use partners like ORCHA or other organizations that will do these assessments for you. You can build up your confidence around what some of the best apps are out there. And again, you can either use formal CPD. ORCHA has a digital health academy where you can go on, sign on. It's free for NHS healthcare professionals if you Google it, and you can learn more about some of the best digital health out there, or you can do your own research. And then start thinking about your process. Think about how this fits into your existing care pathways and the way in which you work. Next slide, please. I want to just kind of end with an example of how I usually manage this in practice. So a couple of months ago, I saw a 15-year-old girl who was presenting with hallmarks of depression or low mood, withdrawn, low self-esteem, very tired, quite irritable at home. And I thought, actually, I could refer to CAMS potentially, but there's a huge waiting list. The school counsellor hasn't been that helpful. So I thought, actually, in the first instance, trying a health app, and there's a number out there that are very effective for young people, might be a useful solution. So I usually start with a simple digital literacy screen. I usually start by asking if they've got a mobile phone, which every 15-year-old has. So asking if they've got a mobile phone and asking how they use it. And that's particularly useful. It's more of a useful question, I think, for groups that we know have difficulty accessing digital. So do you have a phone? Tell me how you use it. If they say that they're comfortable accessing the internet or apps, then just say there are a few options we can try, a referral, medication, or we can try some digital solutions just to assess their openness. And at that point, you've then got a choice. You can either signpost them towards a patient-facing health app library. Your organization might have one, so you could say, go to the hospital, the trust website, you'll see our app library. You might be using ORCHA in your area, so you can say, log into the ORCHA app library. Or if you do have access to a digital health formulary, you'll be able to make a text or an email recommendation there and then for a particular app that you think would be useful. Once you've made the recommendation, make sure you record it in the notes so there is a clear record of what you've suggested. And if you are making a recommendation, make sure the patient has it written down so there's no concerns about spelling or finding the wrong thing. And then lastly, just as though you're starting the patient on the medication, follow up. see what their response is like, see how they've engaged with it, and see whether it continues to be the best option for them. Next slide. So I just want to give you a quick overview about what a formulary and a library looks like. This is the ORCHA formulary. This is actually my favorites screen within the ORCHA formulary. And you can see I've favorited the apps I commonly recommend in practice. You can see they've got the name of the app, they've got the score that the app got in this ORCHA assessment in the bottom right-hand corner. And just by clicking on it, like I have done there with Limbic Access, I can recommend it to the patient, which sends them the details of the app by text or email and records exactly what I recommended. Next slide. Counter that then with the patient-facing app library. This is again a curated list of apps which ORCHA have assessed. We only have the safe, effective ones on here, and patients can then search based on their condition or their issue in the search bar, and that will bring up some of the best apps for their particular condition. Next screen. So the main point with this is that health apps are therapeutic agents. Think of them like starting a medication. So you want to make sure that your recommendations are safe, that they're accurate and the patient won't download the wrong thing, and that there is a record kept. Next slide. So to recap, safety is about process. Make sure that the safety processes are in place. Knowing that the product has been DTAC'd is a good overview, really. You know it's gone through that checklist and produced the documents. But if it hasn't got a DTAC, think how else you can assure yourself that the processes are in place. When it comes to evidence, consider what the app does and make sure your expectations are proportional, pragmatic, but that doesn't mean don't look for the evidence, and that doesn't mean don't scrutinize the evidence to make sure it's high quality. And then lastly, treat health apps like therapeutic agents. So make sure you're recommending the safe ones, make sure you're being accurate in recommendations, and make sure you're keeping a record and audit trail so you can see exactly what you've been suggesting to patients. Next slide. That's it for me. Feel free to jot down, I've got my email address there, tom.micklewright@orchahealth.com or hello@orchahealth.com to respond to general queries. Feel free to reach out. We're on social media, and we've got the Q&A in just a moment. But for now, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll hand you back over to Ben.
Awesome, brilliant. Thank you, Tom. And thanks for stealing the Chris Whitty joke I had lined up. I need to come up with some more original gags than that. So I am going to just talk briefly about the development of safe digital products from a provider perspective and kind of how we at Limbic have approached this. Now, given I've only got 5 minutes, I'm not going to spend time on the first section of the talk, which looks at more of the compliance and regulatory standards and some of the risk mitigation and evidence generation practices that we have gone through, as Tom has kind of covered those mostly in a lot of details, and we can pick that up in a discussion. So can we move forward, please, in the slides to the second half of this deck, where the next big colourful screen comes up? Yeah, here's perfect. So what I am going to talk to is a subset of product safety, which is the use of AI in digital tools. And as Tom actually mentioned, this is where kind of heightened risks can be introduced if precautions aren't taken, and some of the fundamental pillars that should be followed for creating and deploying AI, I'm going to talk to you now to ensure that that the AI is developed safely and also used safely within the product. So the first one is pretty self-explanatory if we move to the next slide. And this is the quality of the team building the AI is really, really important. Now, AI is obviously a specialist skill set, but beyond this, the team building the AI must also be knowledgeable in the field itself, because the context of the deployment of AI is absolutely vital. And also, it's really important that the team have a good track record. So this is things like peer-reviewed publications, citations, collaborations with academic institutes in the space. All of this goes a long way to ensuring there is some kind of basal level of quality that will be met when you're developing AI. Secondly, it's really important to make sure the scope of the AI is really appropriately controlled. And what I mean here is literally what the function is that the AI is performing in the product, and what the constraints are on the reach of the AI system within the product. So this is super important for a couple of reasons, mainly because having a defined, controlled scope naturally limits the potential risks that the AI can cause. And that is, comparative to, say, an unfettered AI, which, is used across a product. So moreover, in doing that, having this defined scope, you enable better identification of associated risks. So Tom spoke a lot about the kind of risk management plan and risk management activities. And when the scope is controlled, you're better able to identify the associated risks that the AI can have in the product, and even more importantly, downstream to the patient, when you're looking at kind of worst case scenario mapping and planning, these sorts of things. And ultimately, better risk identification leads to better risk management, which leads to better safety and having a safer product. So it's really important that the scope is well defined and appropriate. And I guess a quick note to say that also, depending on the scope of the AI, medical device classification starts to come into play here. Potentially the need to up classification depending on the scope, the intended purpose of the product, the risk profile of the product as a whole when it's AI enabled. This is all really important things, particularly for machine learning algorithms. So if we move on to the next slide, the third thing that I want to quickly talk to in my few minutes, and really the main point that I want to convey in this talk, the biggest factor in developing safe but also high quality AI, from a performance perspective, is the data that it is built on. So you can build the best models in the world, but the biggest contributing factor is the quality and the appropriateness of the data used to build, to train, to test, and to validate those models. And it kind of makes sense, right? It's this old kind of idiom, I guess, that is used throughout data science of garbage in, garbage out. And it applies here massively. So to continue Tom's car analogy that he had going on, and it's not a great segue, but imagine the analogy of a car engine and its fuel. You can have the most high-tech engine in the world, but if you're trying to power it on toothpaste, it's just not going to work. And so data that is used to build and train AI needs to be representative. And what I mean here by representative is the data collected from the user population that the product's going to be used in? In this case, i.e. patients. So is the data used to develop the AI data from relevant patients? Are they the right type of patient? But you can also look at things like care setting. Are we talking about a defined care pathway like IAT? Or are we talking about, public wellness settings outside of healthcare where you can go to the app store and download Calm with an R instead of an L? These kind of environments matter massively to the type of data that you get, and therefore the scope of your AI and whether the AI that you've actually trained meets that scope. And demographics and geographies are also important. So if we think about geographies, there is massive differences between healthcare delivery in different geographies around the world, and that matters enormously. Similarly, on the demographic side, you want to make sure that you're covering demographics within a user population. This is the key way that you try and minimize bias in AI systems, which is one of the hallmarks of having safe AI. So you need enough data points from all these different demographics and these different demographic groups that you use to train your AI. And kind of in keeping with that, your data set needs to be large. Now, size isn't everything. It's not the be all and end all. It's important. But really making sure that data is representative is the number one contributing factor here. And that ensures that the AI you developed is appropriate and effective. And if it's appropriate and effective, it's far more likely to be safe. So I'm a little bit over time, but I'll just wrap up quickly with the last two slides. So on to the next slide. Once you've built the AI, it's really important that you have some level of algorithmic transparency. Now, this is particularly for non-rule-based models where the decision-making of the AI isn't binary and isn't as easy to follow. And what I mean here by transparency is it's all about the prevention of black box AI, which means, can I understand what decision the algorithm made in its function that it was doing and why it made that decision? And so as a developer, you need to be able to trace the algorithm decision-making really, really accurately. And there are a bunch of technical methods and also testing methods to do this. And finally, and kind of in keeping with broader software development, how you plan to release and update the algorithm and the control you have around this can massively impact safety. So you need to release in a controlled way, because you need to be confident that adding the AI into the product or updating an algorithm that's already embedded within the product isn't going to impact the live product, add any additional unknown risk, and not cause any further risk to users. So depending on the scope of the AI and its use, this actual kind of release can have far-reaching implications for product stability and ultimately product safety. Now, finally, just to wrap up quickly on the last slide, I just want to quickly touch on testing. Evidence of testing is obviously a given. It's really, really important. I've outlined here a number of ways that different types of testing can be performed, but essentially testing is all about proving that the AI works in the way you said / think / wanted it to work. So, you can do a number of things. You can test the accuracy and the performance of the model. You can test how the model works in isolation, and also how it works when it's integrated within the product. If the output of the AI is user-facing, you can test whether, you need to understand whether the users have been involved and have tested the product, and whether they can understand the output of the AI. And this is all really critical for identifying risks, and also for establishing whether the risk control measures you've put in place have been successful. And that is all really with the aim of stopping the introduction of the AI from negatively impacting users, which largely in this case is going to be patients. So I'll wrap up there. Appreciate I've thrown a lot of detail in there and not a lot of time. As Tom's already spoken to, and Vanessa has as well, the slides will be provided, which has all the information from our end, and a bunch of, tips and questions to ask of providers to get a better understanding of the safety, security, and quality of the products and the AI-enabled products that they're creating. And on the next slide, quickly, my details are there if you want to get in touch. Not just to talk about Limbic, but really to talk about digital technology in general. It's something I'm super passionate and could quite frankly talk for hours about. So thank you, everyone. I think a little bit over time, but we're ready to move on to some questions. Vanessa, if you want to come back in and act as the chair for this bit.
Hello. So yes, we do. So I'd like to jump straight into it. We have had, they say hello. I just wonder, what are the most important metrics, accreditations for us as service leaders to consider when looking at procuring digital products?
Tom, do you want to say from your side first?
Yeah, shall I take that? So I would say that firstly, if it's a medical device, it has to have a CE mark, or it's going to need a new UK CA mark when that kind of comes into place. But yeah, you'll need to make sure it's got that. Otherwise, it's an illegal medical device. It's unauthorized. It means it's not registered with MHRA. It's not going to have any of the post-market surveillance. So I'd say certainly check for that. But a lot of digital health technologies fall under medical device regulations, especially if they're devices that do things like they act as a reference guide, for instance, like the online BNF or the online DSM, or if they're purely educational, so kind of clinician or patient education, so they fall outside medical device regulations. So not everything needs a CE mark. Check if it's a medical device. MHRA has a great flow chart you can work through to see whether or not it is a device or not. And if it is, it has to have a CE mark. Second thing I probably look at is that DTAC, because at least if you know your organization has DTAC'd it, or another organization has given it a DTAC badge like ORCHA, you know that its safety documentation has been checked, and you also know it's been checked in terms of its data security, technical security, and usability and accessibility. Aside from that, I'd obviously advocate an ORCHA score, which I think it just makes it's just a simpler way of bringing all those different regulations into a single place that makes it understandable. But without that, certainly DTAC and CE.
Yeah, I think the only thing to add there is actually that MHRA flowchart that Tom spoke to, I've included in the slides and is linked out of there. So definitely take a look at that. It's a really good resource for this space.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you. Also, let's celebrate the good and the great. I've seen in the answered box already that someone asked what Limbic's ORCHA score, and Tom, you kindly got in there before I could ask it. Let's celebrate your 92%, which Tom writes is extremely difficult to get in an ORCHA assessment. So that's definitely worthwhile mentioning.
Yeah, sorry, again, I didn't have time to touch on that. Obviously, it's something we're incredibly proud of. I think it's the second highest overall in the mental health category behind Grow Health, which, you know, blowing our own trumpet, we're really, really happy with, and with the highest rated overall kind of referral and triage assistant tool as well. So yeah, to put that plug in there.
It's worth noting. So the next question asks of clinical safety. How is clinical safety done on an ongoing basis?
Tom, you happy for me to jump in there with, I guess, from our side and how we approach it? Yeah, so I guess there are two parts to this. The first is around putting the processes in place. So Tom spoke to this idea of risk management plans. Now, there are two key clinical risk management standards that are in play here with digital products. One is the DCP 0129, which is the NHS's clinical risk management standard. But on top of that, there's ISO 14971, which again is a bit of jargon, but is the medical device risk management classification standard. Now, both of those are very similar. Actually, the DCB is based off of the ISO standard, and they essentially produce a framework for creating risk management activities and documentation for any given product. So that's the first bit, is getting that in place. But really, what's more important in that, in a sense, is the ongoing monitoring of that. So again, Tom in his talk was kind of the auditing of these processes and procedures, and that's what's super important. So you know, that's making sure that there is a, you know, these are live documents. You're on an ongoing basis, you're reviewing risk to your product, you're bringing in data from different sources, and this is the really key thing. So you're bringing in data and feedback from patients, you're bringing in data and feedback from usability testing, you're bringing it in from clinicians, from services are doing user testing on an ongoing basis, and so you mix that in with any real world data that you have, and so then you can start to have this feedback loop of data that informs your risks you've identified and new risks that may be producing. And so that, combined with some of the medical device recommendations, requirements where you have to do post-market surveillance, kind of feeds into this, which is looking at, from the data you have, what can you say about the risks you currently have, the control measures you currently have, any new risks you've identified, any side effects, unwarranted side effects, all of these kinds of things come into play. And so that's really, from our side, is what we try and do. We processed over 100,000 referrals now, so we've got a steady stream of data coming from all these different sources, which go into our clinical lead, our clinical safety officer, who kind of performs these on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Do you have anything to add?
I think Ben's kind of covered most of it. The only thing I would add is I think when you're a developer, the way you keep clinical safety continuous when the product is changing is just as Ben said. You know, you have your process in place, you're constantly responsive to any new test results, feedback from clients, safety incidents, and that's how you keep it updated. It becomes harder when you're an organization that's using a solution, because whether you use DTAC, or whether you just say, can you send me your documentation, that's a snapshot in time. And it's not realistic for, a service lead to, once a month say, can you send me all your documentation again? I want to see if anything's changed, which is why the focus when it comes to safety has to be on process. We can't, as clinicians, we can't micromanage the safety process, to the extent that the safety team and the development organization can. What we can do, though, is assure ourselves that the processes are robust enough to adapt to safety challenges that might arise.
Thank you. So I'm going to work bottom up now. I'm flipping around. So the next question is, for risk management and accreditation, use of digital tools in mental health, are there good examples of different strategies for other countries? How is it handled internationally?
I can.
Do you want to go first, Tom?
Yeah, I can make a start of that. So ORCHA have worked with a few organisations across the world. We've worked with the Nordic countries, US, Canada. We're doing some work in Australasia. And I think the first thing to say is that the UK is a world leader when it comes to digital health products. And the reality is that most countries across the world don't have any standards or assessment frameworks in place for digital health at all. Germany has the DIGA. There are a few other countries that have very early embryonic stages frameworks, but most of them don't have anything at all. Where countries are starting to develop their standards, again, I can only speak from my experience at ORCHA, we're trying to align the standards all together. So we've been working to develop the Nordic countries' NORDEC assessment. In the US, we were a key stakeholder in developing the DAF, the Digital Health Assessment Framework, with the idea being that there's kind of a single underlying set of principles that underline assessments across the world. Otherwise, it just becomes a nightmare for developers who are trying with the best intentions to bring these great agents to market, but they're having to constantly jump through different hoops in every single territory they want to operate in.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add on top of that is, particularly with respect to AI, the FDA in the US has really great guidance on the use of machine learning and AI in digital health solutions. So that speaks to a medical device perspective, but it also speaks to a risk management. So I think there is starting to be a leading voice, particularly around AI, coming out of the US, and then obviously Europe and the UK abides by the EU and CE marking regulation that kind of is following behind. But yeah, I think from look at some of the examples in the US for AI-enabled products that are out there.
That is interesting. So I've got time for one more. So you spoke about the challenges around selecting the safest apps for therapy, but in reverse, how does the NHS know who to trust when it comes to evaluating apps?
I mean, I can jump in here first. So I mean,
well, no, actually, Ben, yeah, you go for it.
Yeah, ORCHA are obviously a great example of this. I think primarily you've got to rely on neutral third parties to do this kind of work. ORCHA have demonstrated, obviously, that they are kind of the market leader in the space with respect to the assessment of digital health technologies in this form, but also you can look to regulatory bodies, the MHRA here, or UKABs, which are authorised bodies who perform UKCA marking in the UK, or what are known as notified bodies on the continent in Europe for CE marking. So you've got to look to these kind of third-party independent organisations to do these kind of assessments. I think it can get tricky when there isn't necessarily in some areas a lot of guidance out there, and there are digital providers like us who want to try and talk to some of this stuff, but we cannot and should not be kind of leading in that space, because inevitably we are inherently biased in what we're doing, and sometimes you see kind of digital providers overstep the boundaries in trying to become these kind of independent third parties. So we've got to work hard to avoid that, and I think ultimately it is institutions like ORCHA that really matter here.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, I'm just going to try and integrate another question in for streamlining. Claire's just jumped in and she's asked, how can we encourage a culture of embracing digital technology, particularly within ICB and ICSs?
That's a great question, and we're doing work with a large ICS at the moment in primary care. And the challenge is that even if you get engagements at the ICS level, when you're then trying to get things to work at place and locality level, that requires a monumental effort. You can't just assume that it all kind of trickles down. So I'd say it definitely does have to start at the top. You have to have organizational endorsements. A lot of clinicians will understandably don't want to put their neck on the line if their organization hasn't said anything about digital health. So even something saying, we support the use of these technologies, or here is a library, we're happy that things in this library are safe, is an incredible starting point. But once that's done, the real work needs to happen with staff on the front line. And I think there's no getting around it. We've tried lots of different methods of training and winning hearts and minds and culture change. The best thing is small group face-to-face sessions. They just work. I think very quickly you can show people the technology, you can get them to play around and feel comfortable with the technology, and you can have a frank conversation about the risks and how you use it at practice. I don't think there's really a good replacement for doing that hard work.
No. How about Ben? Does it resonate with you at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that I think Tom's put the nail on the head there. It's yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I completely. Well, thank you so much. We've run out of time today. But if you have any further questions that you'd like to follow up with either Ben or Tom, I know that they would be absolutely delighted to hear from you. And I'm pretty sure that they are sharing their emails with you. So please do follow any further questions, shoot them their way. I know that they'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Bye.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.